The burrow's garden was dark and warm, and smelled like nothing Harry had ever smelled before. He stood in the orchard a moment after climbing out of the car. His trunk bumped against his ankle, and he left it there, and tried to identify the smell. It was soil and night-damp grass and something small and flowering that he couldn't name, and underneath all of it, something savory drifting from the house. The kitchen light was on, yellow and steady against the pre-dawn dark, and someone inside had clearly been awake for a while. Harry had been awake for most of the last 3 days. He felt it the way you feel hunger when you've been ignoring it too long. Not sharp anymore, but pervasive. A bone-deep exhaustion that had settled into everything, even his hands, which hung at his sides and seemed to weigh more than they should. He also knew, had known since somewhere around Bristol, when Ron had said, "Mum doesn't know we're coming in exactly the tone of voice," that means, and there's more to that sentence, that he was about to be in some kind of trouble. Not the usual kind. 11 years of the usual kind had given him a very precise understanding of what it felt like. A locked door, a very specific quality of silence, a hunger that had a schedule. This was different. This was the kind of trouble that came from someone caring enough to do something about things, and Harry had considerably less experience with that variety. Fred vaulted out of the car first, rolling his neck. "If we're quick," he said, keeping his voice low, for Fred, at least, which was still louder than most people's normal, "we can get the car in the shed before she—" The kitchen door opened. The light came out with her, and so did the look on her face. Molly Weasley was short and plump with red hair. She hadn't bothered to put up, wearing a dressing gown covered in small printed owls, and she was furious in the particular way of someone who has spent 3 hours being frightened and is now translating that into something she knows how to use. She came toward them at a speed that was technically a walk. "I have been," she began, and the emphasis she placed on each word carried the full weight of the sentence. "Sitting in that kitchen since midnight. Since midnight. Because not one person in this family thought to leave me a note or send an owl or give me any indication whatsoever of where 3 of my children had gone at 1 in the morning with—" She stopped. Her eyes swept across Fred and George and Ron, and then they landed on Harry. Harry was aware, in the low-level way he had trained himself to be always aware of it, of how he must look. 3 days in Dudley's old clothes, which had always been too large and were now almost comical. The circles under his eyes that he could feel in his skin, the weight he'd lost, more than the usual summer amount, because the cat flap in his bedroom door had turned out to be a less efficient food delivery mechanism than 3 meals a day. He was 12 years old, and he was standing in someone else's garden at 4 in the morning, and he looked precisely like what he was. Molly's expression shifted, not softened. It wasn't soft. What happened to her face? Something moved behind the anger, and the anger didn't go away, but it found a different address. They were starving him, Ron said. He had been waiting to say it, Harry suspected, since at least Bristol, Mum. There were bars on his window. Silence. The pre-dawn garden was very quiet. Somewhere toward the tree line, a bird made a single tentative sound and thought better of it. There should have been a particular kind of response. Harry had been bracing for it. Not consciously, but in the way you brace for things your body has learned to expect. Adults, in Harry's experience, responded to information like this in consistent ways. Your family knows best, or boys have a tendency to dramatize, or I'm sure it wasn't quite as bad as all that. He had learned over 11 years that saying anything at all was usually worse than saying nothing. Molly Weasley did not say any of those things. She stood very still, red, Then her eyes moved from Ron's face to Harry's, slowly, not unkindly, just with the deliberate attention of someone building a picture from available evidence. And downward to where Dudley's sleeves came past Harry's hand, to the collar of the enormous T-shirt, to the outline of his shoulders. How long has this been happening? There was no joke in it, no edge of dismissal, no effort to get past the awkward thing and onto something more manageable. It was a question asked in a voice that had decided, somewhere in the previous 10 seconds, that it was going to receive an answer. Harry did not know what to do with that. Questions that sounded like it usually wanted something simple, a reassurance, a confirmation that there was nothing to worry about, a silence that could be interpreted as a negative. Molly Weasley was looking at him with Ron's face, the same face Ron had worn 3 nights ago when he'd pulled the bars loose from the bedroom window and sat there for a moment holding one of them, with an expression Harry hadn't been able to look at for very long. The face of someone frightened by a thing they could no longer pretend wasn't real. Harry started. He stopped. This summer was worse than usual with the bars. Normally it's just, he found he couldn't finish that sentence without the rest of the explanation attached to it, and the rest of the explanation was long and started in a cupboard under some stairs 11 years ago, and he was tired in the kind of way that made long explanations feel like lifting something heavy. "A while," he said. "It's been going on for a while." Molly held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside." And it was not a gentle voice, but it was a certain one, which was, Harry was already beginning to understand how she said most things. Arthur appeared from upstairs shortly afterward, belting his dressing gown, his thinning red hair in complete disarray. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and took in the scene, the boys around the table, Molly's expression, Harry eating toast with the methodical focus of someone who has learned not to let food go to waste when it appears. Then his eyes went to the window, in the direction of the orchard. Once. Briefly. Not at anything he could see through the glass, but in the way of someone performing a private, anxious calculation. He had spent a long time watching adults do their quiet arithmetic. He recognized the shape of this one. Arthur worked in the office that regulated enchanted Muggle objects, and his flying car was now parked in his own orchard, and those two facts appeared to be occupying the same anxious corner of his mind. Molly hadn't said anything about the car yet. Harry had a feeling that was a particular kind of warning. "Molly," Arthur said carefully. "Sit down, Arthur," she said. He sat down. She fed them all. This was, Harry would come to understand, what Molly Weasley did when she was feeling something she hadn't yet finished. Deciding what to do with, she cooked, and she put things in front of people, and she watched them eat. There was more toast, and there were eggs, and there was tea strong enough to stand a spoon in. Fred and George ate with the gratitude of people who understood what they had coming. Ron ate with one eye on his mother. Harry ate because the food was in front of him, and because the part of him that had spent 3 days calculating how much could reasonably fit through a cat flap was still running the numbers. At some point Percy appeared at the top of the stairs. Harry could see him from the table, tall and neat, even in pajamas, standing very still on the landing, taking in the scene below. He was 15, and in 3 weeks he would be 16, and in September he was going to be a prefect. Whatever he was calculating up there on the stairs, he did it in silence. Then Molly said, "Percy," in a particular tone, and Percy said, "I'm going back to bed," and went. Eventually the food was eaten, and the boys were sent upstairs. Ron showed Harry the room at the end of the landing, small, warm, smelling of the same indefinable something as the rest of the house, and Harry's body made the decision to sleep before his mind could finish being uncertain about it. He did not hear the sounds from the kitchen below, the scrape of a chair pushed back, the soft rattle of a drawer, the quill that started and stopped, and then started again, feeling its way toward the right words. He did not hear Arthur Weasley stand in the kitchen doorway for a long moment and say nothing at all, because there was nothing particularly useful to say, and Arthur Weasley was a man who understood the difference. And downstairs in Molly's handwriting, a letter slowly took shape, addressed to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Ministry of Magic, while outside the kitchen window the sky made its slow, indifferent shift from black to grey to the first pale wash of morning. The owl left at first light. Molly stood at the kitchen window and watched it go, a large brown burrow owl she trusted for ministry correspondence, steady against the pale August sky, climbing south. The letter it carried was 2 pages of parchment written in her best hand. She had drafted it 3 times. The first draft had been angry. The second had been careful. The third had been both, in the proportions that mattered, specific, factual, signed with her full name. She had written the date Harry arrived. She had written bars on the window of the bedroom, since removed. Bracket marks and screw holes remain in the frame. She had written cat flap installed in the bedroom door, used to pass food through. She had written confined to the bedroom for 3 days, permitted out twice daily to use the bathroom, and underlined twice daily because 2 times was not a number she was willing to let slide into imprecision. She had listed her sons as witnesses, in order from youngest to oldest, because that was how she'd taught herself to think clearly, methodically, oldest concerns first. Upstairs, Harry was still asleep. She could hear the faint creak of old joists settling in the summer warmth, and somewhere above that, the silence of a boy who had slept very deeply for the first time in what she suspected was a while. She watched the owl until it was a speck against the tree line. Then she put the kettle on and stood at the hob with her hands wrapped around the handle of the kettle and thought, not for the first time since last night, about how long it had taken her to ask the question and how long he had taken to answer it. A while, he had said. It's been a while. She turned the hob up. Ron appeared on the stairs at 7:15, still in his pajamas, and stopped when he saw her face. Did you? He started. Yes, she said. Sit down, I'll do eggs. He sat. He didn't ask anything else. For once, she was grateful for that. Amelia Bones read the letter twice. The second time she read it more slowly, the way she read everything that arrived with its facts already in the right order, because the facts being in the right order told her something about the person who had assembled them. She had been head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 4 years, and she had a reliable sense for the complaints that were going to move through her office quietly, and the ones that were going to move through everything else instead. This was the second kind. The complainant was Molly Weasley, née Pruitt. The subject was Harry James Potter, 12 years of age, registered at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The document was precise and witnessed. The allegations, bars on the window, a cat flap in the bedroom door, used for food delivery, confinement to the bedroom for 3 days. 2 permitted bathroom visits per day. It arrived in 7 minutes. A folder, thicker than she'd expected, carried in by a junior clerk who was plainly curious about why the head of DMLE had asked for it personally on a Tuesday morning. She sent him back out without answering the question. The most recent item in the file was a hover charm warning, issued 11 days prior. Standard form, underage magic in a muggle dwelling. First warning. She knew the improper use of Magic Office's limitation, as well as she knew the layout of her own desk. The trace could not identify the specific wand in a muggle household. The warning had been dispatched on the assumption that the nearest minor wizard was responsible. The nearest minor wizard had been Harry Potter. The magic had been performed at a dinner party. The charm had dropped a pudding on someone's head. She made a note. Beneath the Hover Charm correspondence, she found the 1991 administrative records. Hogwarts admissions letters, filed as standard procedure. She pulled them and read the address line once. Then she read it again. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, I've Little Whinging, Surrey. She sat with that. The Hogwarts addressing system was not a clerical function. It was a charm. Old, precise, not given to approximation. It located the place where the recipient actually slept. The letters for September 1991 had been addressed accordingly. Harry Potter had slept in a cupboard under a staircase in the summer of 1991. He was 12 years old this August. He had been at Hogwarts for 1 full year between those 2 dates and had then been returned to that address. The question of who had arranged that return, and with what knowledge, was a question she intended to put to Albus Dumbledore. She sent for Dawlish and told him to sit down. The memo from Bones's office reached Cornelius Fudge at 10:30, which was the worst possible time. The International Confederation of Wizards Autumn Conference was 3 weeks away. The scheduling of it was already a disaster. And his morning had contained more unpleasant things than he'd budgeted for. He read it standing up, still in his lime-green bowler hat, and he did not sit down. Fudge was not without political instincts. He had reached the minister's office by reading, quickly and consistently, the difference between the problems that could be managed and the problems that could not. This letter was the second kind, and he understood that within approximately 40 seconds of beginning it. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the savior of the wizarding world, the child whose survival had ended the First Wizarding War, had been found with bars on his bedroom window, kept in a room with a cat flap. This had occurred at the address chosen by Albus Dumbledore, who had placed the boy there in 1981 and, apparently, continued to return him there annually since. Whatever Fudge did, he was going to offend someone powerful. Proceeding with the investigation offended Dumbledore. Not proceeding offended Bones, who was not a woman who accepted interference graciously, and who had a habit of going on record when she felt her office was being obstructed. The press would hear of it either way. He sent a reply to Bones's office. Proceed as appropriate at your discretion. He sent a note to his personal secretary. Keep the initial press notification list short and do not discuss sources. He sent nothing to Dumbledore, because anything he sent to Dumbledore would constitute a record of his awareness, and he had not yet decided what shape his awareness ought to take. By noon, 2 members of the Magical Law Enforcement Squad were dispatched south towards Surrey in Muggle attire, with instructions to be discreet. Bones wrote the formal notification to Albus Dumbledore herself because she wanted the phrasing to be hers. It confirmed Harry Potter's status as Dumbledore's ward under the placement of 1981. It noted the received complaint and the existing file contents. It requested Dumbledore's cooperation with the department's inquiry and a detailed account of the conditions in which his ward had been placed and the reasoning behind them. The notification was not unkind. She wrote it the way she wrote all her consequential correspondence, plainly, specifically, and without the kind of diplomatic softening that could later be read as an invitation to delay. She sealed it with the department's official mark and sent it north. Arthur arrived at Office 4B at 5 minutes to 12 and found his supervisor already seated. He had been expecting this since the moment the car landed in the orchard. The enchantment on the Ford Anglia was registered to him. A muggle along the road outside Ottery St. Catchpole had reported something large and blue and airborne in the pre-dawn hours, which was, of course, the car, and the car was registered to him, and the enchantment was his, and none of that was going to be easy to explain to a room that contained his supervisor. He gave the account that was truthful, insofar as it went. The car had been taken by his sons, without his specific awareness of where they were going. He had not personally operated it. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and he did not mention Surrey, and he did not mention a barred window, and he did not mention Harry Potter, and the absence of all three of those things sat in the room like a fourth person, whose name nobody was saying. He was reprimanded. He accepted it. He walked out of Office 4B at 12:30 and stood in the corridor for a moment by himself. That evening he came home to the smell of dinner and the sound of the twins arguing somewhere upstairs, and he found Molly at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "It's been opened," he said quietly. "The investigation. Bones took it." Molly looked at him. He saw the thing move behind her eyes that he'd seen move there last night, when Harry had said a while and not been able to finish the sentence. "Good," she said. The stairs creaked. Neither of them moved. The creak ascended slowly, one step at a time, and then the landing went quiet. Percy had always been a light sleeper, and Arthur had always known when he was listening, and some things were easier to pretend not to notice than others. He reached across the table and put his hand over Molly's. Neither did he. The kitchen clock ticked, and somewhere upstairs Harry Potter slept on, and the owl that had left the burrow at first light was already somewhere over London, its errand done. The castle was nearly empty. In the way that old buildings are never quite empty, it breathed and settled and produced sounds that had no visible source. The suits of armor stood at their posts in the deserted corridors. The portraits dozed and muttered, and occasionally shifted canvases. The staircases swung on their own slow schedules, carrying no one. Albus Dumbledore sat at his desk in the circular office and read a volume on 17th century alchemical theory and thought about other things. He had spent the summer months thinking about the horizon. Not literally. He was 111 years old, and literal horizons had long since ceased to provide novelty. But about the thing beyond it, Tom Riddle was alive. Not alive in any meaningful sense, not embodied, not anchored, not powerful in the ways that had once made him a catastrophe, but alive in the sense that mattered most to the long calculation, present and conscious and waiting. Dumbledore had spent 12 years monitoring the periphery for signs of his return. He watched the movements of certain individuals. He read letters from people who did not know they were informants. He kept a very careful account of the things that had not happened yet, because, in his experience, the things that had not happened yet were usually the most important ones. The ministry owl that arrived through his open office window at 8:30 on a Tuesday in mid-August was not his usual correspondence. He recognized the seal before the bird had settled. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement did not write to Hogwarts often. He opened the letter with the small brass knife he kept on the left side of his desk for precisely this category of moment, the ones that required an even hand, and read it through to the end. The notification: a formal complaint had been filed with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement regarding the welfare of the minor wizard, Harry James Potter, age 12, registered at 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey, under a guardianship arrangement made by the headmaster of Hogwarts. The department requested his full cooperation with the ongoing investigation and a detailed account of the conditions in which his ward had been placed and the reasoning behind the placement. The letter was signed by Amelia Bones. He read it to the end. Then he set it on the desk. in the pool of morning light that fell through the tall window, and looked at it. He did not experience surprise. He had a very precise relationship with surprise by now. It required information he had genuinely not anticipated. He had anticipated this, not this letter, not this specific week, not through this exact channel, but something like it. Eventually. Because eventually things that were true had a way of being seen. He had known since the summer of 1991. That was the specific and ungenerous fact of it. Hogwarts letters did not use the Royal Mail. They used a charm a great deal older and considerably more accurate than any postal system. The charm identified the precise place where the recipient slept. In the summer of 1991, it had addressed the letters for Harry Potter to the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Ive Little Whinging, Surrey. He had known that before the letters were sent. He had considered it, and then he had sent Harry back anyway, at the end of each year, because the bond of blood required it. The bond of blood was not a preference. It was anchored in Petunia Dursley's blood, and it remained active only so long as Harry could call that house his home, and a home required returning to it. And any permanent removal from it would dissolve the charm entirely and leave Harry unprotected in a world where Tom Riddle was alive and patient. That Harry was his specific concern. Those were mechanics. They were not choices. He had been weighing mechanics against conditions, and the mechanics had won. And now a 12-year-old boy had been found with bars on his window and a cat flap in his bedroom door, and a record of being fed through a slot. He became aware in the stillness of his summer office that the weighing might have been wrong. Not the conclusion. The conclusion was still correct. The bond of blood was still necessary. Harry still could not be permanently removed. But the assumption behind it, the one he had never quite examined, that the necessity of the annual return had absolved him of all responsibility for what Harry returned to. He was sitting with that when McGonagall appeared in the doorway. She had not knocked. She was holding her own copy of the DMLE notification. As deputy headmistress, she would have received one as a matter of administrative procedure, and her face was exactly as composed as it always was, which was to say that the composure itself was the thing worth attending to. "Did you know?" she said. "Minerva," he said. "Did you know about the conditions?" She did not inflect it as a question. In 40 years of knowing her, he had observed that she very rarely raised her voice when she was genuinely angry. She reserved that for lesser occasions. What she did instead, when the anger was deep enough, was go very still and speak very clearly. The cupboard, the cat flap, the bars on the window. He did not answer immediately. He allowed the silence to do the work it was suited for, and in doing so answered her anyway. "Sit down," he said. She stepped into the room. The cupboard was 1991. The letters were addressed to it. "I was aware," he said, "that the living arrangements were imperfect. I did not have specific knowledge of everything that has been reported this summer. The bars and the cat flap appear to be recent measures. Recent measures taken because the boy came to Hogwarts and came back a wizard," McGonagall said. "And you knew that would happen. You knew what the Dursleys thought of magic before you placed him there." She stopped. Started again with the precise control of someone who has decided how angry they are going to permit themselves to be. "You have explained the bond of blood to me before. I understand that he must return. I am asking about the cupboard. The bond does not require a cupboard." Any interference risked. What did it risk, Albus, specifically? He considered the honest answer, that he had not wanted to introduce conflict into the arrangement, had not wanted Harry to feel that Privet Drive was a place he was being made to go, rather than a home he could choose, because the bond was contingent on something that at least resembled belonging. He considered the other honest answer, which was that he had not looked very closely, because looking closely would have required doing something about what he saw. The bond of blood, he said, required that he call the house home. I was concerned that any external pressure, any change in the arrangement that came from outside would fracture the relationship in ways that affected the protection. He was sleeping in a cupboard, McGonagall said. I do not believe your intervention was the primary obstacle to his sense of belonging. The door opened. Snape did not knock. He was in his black teaching robes, despite the August heat, and he had the particular expression he wore when he had heard enough of a conversation from outside to understand it without having been invited to. He looked at McGonagall, and then at Dumbledore, and then at the DMLE notification on the desk. It cannot result in permanent removal, he said. Not a question. A position stated from the doorway, as though he had crossed the castle specifically to say it. Whatever the investigation concludes. McGonagall turned to look at him. You were in the corridor. His voice was exactly as flat and uninflected as it always was when he was managing something that cost him something. The notification was circulated to senior staff. I am aware of its contents. He looked at Dumbledore. If the Ministry removes him permanently from the Dursley house before he is 17, any removal, any alternative guardianship, any arrangement that means he is not returning to Privet Drive and calling it home, the bond ends. It does not weaken. It ends. Whatever Molly Weasley's intentions were, the investigation cannot be permitted to achieve that outcome. We are aware, McGonagall said, with the particular quiet that meant she was choosing not to argue the point she most wanted to argue. Then act accordingly. Snape looked at Dumbledore with something that was not quite a request and not quite a demand, and was the expression Dumbledore had come to recognize over the years of a man whose entire life had been arranged around a single fixed point. The investigation will try to remove him. That cannot be allowed. I do not intend, Dumbledore said, to obstruct the investigation. A very brief pause. Then what do you intend? Cooperation, Dumbledore said. Snape left without further response. McGonagall remained at the doorway a moment longer, and the expression she gave Dumbledore before she turned and went was not the sharp heat of anger, but something that had settled into a quieter temperature. The look of someone who has confirmed a thing they had been hoping to find was false, and has now adjusted accordingly. Dumbledore sat alone in his office. After a while, he drew a fresh sheet of parchment toward him. He wrote his reply to Amelia Bones with the care he applied to all his most consequential letters, which meant that each sentence was true and disclosed nothing beyond what was necessary. He confirmed receipt of the notification. He confirmed that Harry Potter was his ward, and that the placement at 4 Privet Drive had been deliberate. He stated that the reasoning behind the placement was substantive, and required more than a letter to convey adequately. He requested a meeting in person, at a mutually convenient time, to provide the full context. He read it back twice. Nothing in it was false. Nothing in it was quite what Amelia Bones had asked for. He told himself that was the nature of measured cooperation. You gave what you could sustain giving, and you kept back what the situation could not yet support revealing, and you bought time until the situation changed in ways that made more revelation possible. He told himself that. He sealed the letter with the Hogwarts crest. He sent it south. The portraits on the walls had been watching him for the last hour, and none of them said anything, which was unusual for portraits of former headmasters. He supposed they were being kind. Number 4, Privet Drive, looked exactly like number 3 and number 5, which was clearly the point. The gardens were symmetrical, The cars in the driveways were the same make in different colors. The net curtains, from where the two investigators stood on the pavement, were identical net curtains. The street had the particular quality of a place that had decided collectively that difference was something that happened somewhere else. Davies and Fenn had driven down from London that morning in a car that would not attract attention, wearing the kind of clothes that communicated official business without specifying the office. They had 2 copies of the case file, a set of evidence documentation forms, and a camera with a charm on it that passed for a standard camera to anyone not looking closely. They had spent the drive going over the complaint and the supplementary file Bones had pulled together, and they had discussed, as a practical matter, which of them would lead the interviews. Davies had won. He had a face that made people feel they were dealing with something institutional and disinterested, which was more useful than the kind of face that made people feel defensive before the first question was asked. The woman at number 2 was in her front garden when they walked past, doing something precise and unnecessary to a rose bush that was perfectly tidy already. She watched them with the careful attention of a person who considered surveillance a form of community service. Davies gave her a brief professional nod and kept walking. He knocked at number 4. The man who answered was large. Large in the specific way of someone who had not always been and had not made peace with it, with a thick, dark mustache and a complexion that suggested he found most things irritating. He looked at the ministry identification card Davies produced, the kind that read as standard government credentials to muggle eyes, and his face went through several calculations in very quick succession. "What's this about?" he said. "Not quite a question. We're here regarding Harry James Potter, registered at this address," Davies said. "There's been a complaint filed relating to his welfare. We'd like to see the bedroom he uses." Vernon Dursley, per the case file, held the door open. His face had settled into an expression that was working toward calm and hadn't got there. The bedroom was the second on the right at the top of the stairs. It was a reasonably sized room for a muggle house of this type. Second bedroom, south-facing window, storage space under the eave. Davies opened the door while Fenn set up the documentation forms. The bars were gone. The complaint had accounted for that, removed physically by the 3 Weasley boys who had retrieved Harry Potter in early August. But the window frame told a different story. The bracket marks were 4 sets of precise indentations in the painted wood, 2 per bar, and the screw holes were the correct gauge and spacing for the iron brackets the Weasley report had described. Fenn photographed each set from 3 angles. Davies measured the spacing and wrote it down. The cat flap was still in the bedroom door. It had been cut into the lower panel and fitted with a wooden flap that opened inward, and it sat at approximately the height of a meal tray. Fenn crouched and opened it from the outside, and held it open, and looked through. The angle it provided was exactly sufficient to pass through a plate. He photographed it from the corridor side, and then from the room side, and wrote down the dimensions, and Davies wrote down the dimensions independently for the cross-reference, and neither of them said anything about it. In the corner stood an owl cage, large and well-made, empty. The door of the cage had a padlock on it. The padlock was on the outside, which meant that whatever it was intended to prevent, it was not the owl getting out. There was no owl. Fenn photographed the cage and the padlock and the way the padlock sat. They were in the room for 14 minutes. When they came downstairs, Vernon Dursley was in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, and the expression on his face had completed its journey from working toward calm to something that had given up on that and settled for contained. Davies sat across from him. Fenn stood by the window and took notes. "The bars," Davies said. "When were they installed?" "For the boys' safety," Vernon said. "He's dangerous. He gets into things." Vernon's eyes went to the ceiling. It was a brief movement, unconscious, as though the ceiling were where the relevant event had happened, and he was reminding himself of it. He performed. There was an incident. A business dinner, here at the house. He performed magic, illegal magic. "Your people sent a letter about it." "We did," Davies said. The letter stated that magic had been detected in a muggle dwelling in the vicinity of a minor wizard. It did not confirm the source. The trace system that monitors underage magic cannot identify a specific wand in a household where no other magic users are present. It can only identify that the magic occurred within range. Vernon's moustache moved. He was there. Quite a few people were there by the account in the letter. He did it. A pause. He must have. When were the bars installed? After the dinner, and the cat flap in the bedroom door? Vernon set his jaw. For food. If the boy is confined to his room, you still have to give him food. That's not unusual. Children are punished. That's normal. How long was he confined? Until we could be sure he wouldn't do anything. The cat flap, Fenn said from the window. It was installed with screws. That's a permanent fixture, not something you'd put in for a short-term arrangement. Vernon said nothing. The bars on the window, Davies said, were also permanent fixtures. 4 brackets screwed into the window frame. The magic. He's not normal, Vernon said. The word came out with the full weight of everything he'd meant by it for 11 years. It seemed to surprise even him slightly, sitting there in his kitchen in front of 2 people he didn't know. He recalibrated. He needed to be managed, he said. For his own safety, for the safety of our family. Petunia Dursley was interviewed in the sitting room. She was thin and blonde, with a bearing that communicated very clearly that she considered the current situation an imposition she had done nothing to deserve. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she answered the bar's question in the same words Vernon had used, which meant she had either thought the same thing independently or had listened to his interview from the hallway, and those 2 possibilities were not mutually exclusive. The bars were a safety precaution, she said. He used magic without permission. He was confined for his own good, and the cat flap for food. She said it briskly as though that completed the matter. "Mrs. Dursley," Davies said, and put the copies on the coffee table between them. "Do you know why the Hogwarts letters in 1991 were addressed to the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Ive?" Petunia went very still. It was not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a woman who has been conducting an interview with a specific alarm in her chest for the last 10 minutes and has just received the thing that set it off. Copies were on the table. 3 letters, 3 identical envelopes from the summer of 1991, the Hogwarts crest on the back, the address on the front in green ink, clear as anything Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs. She looked at them. She did not reach for them. "He has a bedroom," she said. "He does now," Davies said. "The question is about 1991. He has always had a bedroom." She lifted her chin slightly. "The second bedroom, he's had it for years. The letters from the summer of 1991 were addressed to a cupboard under your stairs," Davies said. "Not by accident. The addressing system for Hogwarts correspondence doesn't use a postal directory. It uses a charm. The charm locates where the recipient sleeps. In the summer of 1991, Harry Potter was sleeping in a cupboard. The sitting room was very quiet. Through the wall to the kitchen came a sound. The refrigerator opening. The particular heaviness of someone large moving around in a small space, cupboards being investigated. Petunia did not look toward the sound. She was looking at the copies on the table with the expression of someone performing a specific and rapid calculation. She knew more than she was going to say. That was clear enough. Davies had interviewed enough people in enough situations to read the shape of a person holding something back. And this was not evasion out of ignorance. There was something she knew about these letters, about the charm, about the address, about the reasons that address had been correct, that she had decided, in the space of the last 30 seconds, was not going in this conversation. "He was moved," she said, "before his letters arrived. We moved him to the bedroom. Moved from the cupboard before the letters came." She said it again, carefully. "Before..." As though the timing were the thing she had decided was the most defensible part. "He was living in a cupboard under a staircase," Fenn said, "for some portion of his childhood prior to 1991. Petunia's jaw was set in the way of a woman who has decided where the line is and is not going past it. "He has a bedroom now," she said. The boy was in the kitchen doorway when Fenn went upstairs to retrieve the documentation kit. Not summoned, not dismissed. Present, the way a child can be present in their own house, when the house contains strangers doing something interesting. He was 12 years old, and large. Not tall, but broad, with the rounded solidity of someone for whom the refrigerator opened reliably and often. He watched Fenn with the expression of someone who had been told, firmly, not to ask questions, and was finding this very difficult. Fenn noted his approximate height and weight in the file without saying anything to him, because interviewing him was not within the scope of the visit, and because the note required no conversation to make its point. He was 12 years old. Harry Potter was 12 years old. They lived in the same house, under the same roof, eating from the same kitchen. The contrast sat in the file and did not require elaboration. Davies and Fenn left number 4, Privet Drive, at 20 minutes past 2. They had been inside for 1 hour and 21 minutes. Between them they carried photographs of 4 sets of bracket marks and screw holes on the second-floor window frame, a photograph of a cat flap fitted into a bedroom door at meal tray height, a photograph of a padlocked owl cage, padlock on the outside, 3 copied letters from the Hogwarts admissions records addressed to the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. A written record of 2 interviews that had not, taken together, produced anything like a consistent account. The woman at number 2 watched them walk to the car. "Bones will want this today," Fenn said. "She'll want it before we got here," he said. The car pulled away from the curb in the direction of the motorway, and the street settled back into its perfectly regular quiet, and at number 4 Privet Drive, the curtain in the sitting room moved, and then was still. 3 weeks at the Burrow had done something to Harry's face. He hadn't noticed it at first. The Burrow didn't have many mirrors, and the ones it did have tended to offer opinions on his hair rather than useful information. But that morning, getting ready for Diagon Alley, he'd seen himself in the bathroom and done a slight double take. He looked more like himself. That was the only way he could put it. Whatever he'd looked like when he stepped out of the Ford Anglia, at 4 in the morning in the Burrow's orchard, hollowed out, he thought that was the word, like the frame of something. He looked less like that now. He'd been eating 3 meals a day for 22 days. Apparently that showed the Weasley household at 6 in the morning was a specific kind of chaos that Harry had come to think of as one of his favorite things. Flu powder had been established as the method of travel, and the kitchen had the feel of a military operation being managed by someone who had given up on calm in favor of competent. Molly handed out powder in precise portions and pointed people at the fireplace in a specific order, and Harry went through second, and the world turned green and hot and roaring, and he came out wrong in a dark shop he didn't recognize, with shelves of things he didn't want to look at too closely, and then Hagrid's enormous silhouette filled a doorway, and he was guided back to the leaky cauldron with one large, gentle hand between his shoulder blades, and that was that. The Weasleys were waiting when he arrived. Ginny grabbed his arm the moment she saw him, with the expression of someone who had been managing anxiety about a small thing in order not to think about a large one, the small thing being Harry's brief disappearance. She was 11, which still surprised Harry slightly. He had known her as Ron's little sister for a year, which had meant a small, red-haired, shy presence at the edges of rooms. Now she was 11 and going to school and vibrating faintly with the effort of acting calmer than she was. "The books first," Molly said, steering them all toward Flourish and Blots. "And don't let Fred and George near the whiz-hard section." The bookshop was packed. A life-size moving photograph in the window explained it. Gilderoy Lockhart, waving from behind his own display, wearing robes the color of spring periwinkles. Inside, the crowd was pressed 3 deep around a table where the real Lockhart was signing his collected works, and the air smelled of fresh paper and a particularly aggressive cologne. Lockhart spotted Harry almost immediately. Harry had learned this was inevitable, and was getting faster at the resigned acceptance required. And Harry spent the next several minutes in a situation involving a camera and the phrase, "Fame's a fickle friend, Harry," while Ron watched with an expression that he was unable to fully disguise. They were in the process of extricating themselves when Lucius Malfoy walked in. Voila! Harry knew Draco's father, the way you know the source of a particular kind of cold, not by looking at it directly, but by the way everything in the room shifted slightly. Lucius Malfoy was tall and pale, with long blonde hair that fell to his shoulders and the kind of still, considered way of moving that suggested he found most rooms easy to hold. He had a silver-handled cane and grey eyes that did what Draco's tried to do, which was locate the people he considered worth, locating and dismiss the rest, without moving his face. He found Harry first, then Arthur. Then briefly, so briefly Harry almost missed it, the rest of the Weasley family, one by one, with the attention of someone counting chairs. "Arthur Weasley," Lucius said pleasantly, "and the whole family." He stopped beside Ginny, who was holding her cauldron and her new Lockhart books, with the combined uncertainty of someone who has been enjoying herself and has just encountered a reason to stop. Lucius reached into the cauldron, a languid gesture, the performance of a man who has the leisure to be contemptuous, and drew out a battered old copy of a beginner's guide to transfiguration. "Second-hand books," he said, turning it over. He looked at Arthur. "How wonderfully resourceful. I suppose one does what one must." Arthur's jaw was set. Harry had seen that particular set before, at the Ministry, on the day the Ford Anglia had featured in an official interview. "Put it back, Lucius," Arthur said. "Of course." Lucius dropped it back into the cauldron. His hand went in once more. A brief movement, apparently adjusting the stack, and came back empty. No one noticed. Ginny shifted the cauldron on her arm and kept her eyes down. "I heard," Lucius said, still pleasant, his eyes on Arthur's face, "that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement has had quite the interesting summer. Something to do with a welfare complaint." He left a particular pause. "A child. Named, I believe." Arthur did not say anything. The set of his jaw was doing the work. His voice wasn't. "How public-spirited," Lucius said of someone. He moved away before Arthur could respond. Draco, who had been standing slightly behind his father, in the way of someone who has learned that standing slightly behind his father is the safest position, fell into step alongside him. Halfway to the door, Draco looked back, and his gaze found Harry with the accuracy of a year's worth of practice. "Potter," he said. Just the name. The way he said it had an edge Harry couldn't quite account for. Not the usual Malfoy contempt, which Harry knew the shape of by now, but something sharper underneath it. The edge of knowing something without being supposed to know it. "Enjoy whatever it is you're enjoying." A pause. "While you can," he followed his father out. Harry stood in the middle of the bookshop and felt the weight of the thing he hadn't been able to name for 3 weeks settle a little more specifically onto his shoulders. Ron had told him, 2 days after they arrived at the burrow. He'd been careful about it, careful in the way Ron was careful, which was the way of someone who understood the important thing but was uncertain about the surrounding parts. Mum sent a letter, he'd said, to the ministry. About what the Dursleys were doing to you. He'd said it in a rush, and then looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had delivered a thing, and was now waiting to learn if it was the right thing. Harry hadn't known what to do with it then. He still didn't. He knew his aunt and uncle were going to be furious. That was the part he could see clearly. Vernon's face, the particular shade of red going purple, that meant something had been done that could not be easily undone. He knew there would be consequences to that, though he could not yet see their shape. He had spent 11 years in a house where the texture of consequences was something he tracked instinctively, the way other people tracked the weather. What he couldn't name, the thing that had been sitting in his chest since Ron said it, that had shifted slightly heavier when Lucius Malfoy said the word welfare across a bookshop, was the thing underneath the fury about not going back. He had spent every summer at Privet Drive wishing he was somewhere else, and now someone had apparently done something about that, and he found, to his own complete surprise, that the thing he kept coming back to was not relief. It was the question of where, then? If not Privet Drive, if not the second bedroom and the cat flap and the bars that were gone now, but whose bracket marks were presumably still in the window frame, if not that, then what? The burrow was not his. He loved it. He loved it with a comprehensiveness that embarrassed him, slightly. But it wasn't his. And the difference between a place you love and a home you belong to was something he hadn't known he knew, until he was standing in a bookshop in Diagon Alley holding it. He didn't have another home. He didn't know what it meant if he couldn't go back to the one that had never been one either. They left Flourish and blots loaded with Lockhart's collected works and the rest of the school list, and Ginny carried her cauldron carefully through the crowd, both hands on the rim. She was glowing slightly, the particular glow of a person whose first day at a new school is less than a week away, and who has just bought all the books they'll need. She had her mother's purposefulness and her brother's timing, and she held the cauldron level all the way back to the leaky cauldron, and she did not look inside it. The diary was at the bottom, under the Lockhart books, under the old Transfiguration textbook. It was thin and black, its cover worn smooth with age, and if you picked it up and opened it, you would find nothing inside, no handwriting, no marks of any kind, just blank pages, a 50-year-old blank diary with TM. Riddle printed on the front in faded gold. Ginny did not pick it up. She was telling Ron about the wand she'd chosen, and listening to him be not quite as dismissive about it as he was pretending to be. And she was 5 days from Hogwarts, and she was 11 years old, and she was happy. The diary lay at the bottom of the cauldron all the way home. The meeting room on level 2 was not designed for comfort, which Dumbledore considered appropriate. It was a functional room. 1 table, 6 chairs, a window that looked onto a stone wall, and the kind of silence that came not from quiet, but from the deliberate suppression of the building's usual noise. The Ministry's interior magic kept the deeper levels cool, regardless of what the world was doing above them. It was 4 degrees colder down here than it had been in the atrium. Amelia Bones was already seated when he arrived. She was a broad, square-jawed witch, with very short grey hair, and the kind of face that had passed through expressions of surprise some years ago and not gone back for them. She wore a monocle over her right eye, and she had a file open on the table in front of her, and when Dumbledore took his seat across from her, she folded her hands on top of it and waited for him to settle without saying anything, which he recognized as a precise social tool. Cornelius Fudge was in the chair at the end of the table sideways to both of them, which was itself a kind of statement present, but not quite presiding. He was wearing a pinstriped cloak over his robes, and still had his lime-green bowler hat on, which he tended to do when he was nervous. He had found, Dumbledore suspected, that it made him feel more like himself. The room smelled faintly of tobacco. It was not a smell that came from the walls. "Thank you for coming," Bones said, and the courtesy was genuine, which was more unsettling than it would have been if it weren't. "I had no intention of being uncooperative," Dumbledore said. "No," she said. "You did intend to be uninformative. Those are not the same thing." She opened the file. "I'll summarize the investigation's findings and then I'll ask you a question." She laid it out concisely, and without editorializing the investigator's report from number 4. Privet Drive, late August 1992. The bracket marks on the second-floor window frame, 4 sets, correct gauge for iron bars. The cat flap installed in the bedroom door at a height consistent with a meal tray. The padlocked owl cage. She placed photographs on the table as she spoke. Dumbledore looked at each one. He had not seen photographs of the room before, and finding himself looking at them now produced a sensation he declined to identify precisely. Then the copies of the 1991 admissions letters, addressed to the cupboard under the stairs. She placed those on the table, too. Harry Potter was sleeping in a cupboard under a staircase in the summer of 1991, she said. The magical addressing system for Hogwarts correspondence is precise. It identified that address because it was accurate. She looked at him. He was sleeping in a cupboard when you sent him back at the end of his first year. The bars on the window appear to have been installed that same summer. You were notified by the Hufflecharm warning in early August that something had occurred at that address, but the warning letter addressed Harry as the suspected party and took no welfare action. I am asking you why you placed a 12-year-old in this house, why you have returned him to it every year, and why, in view of the information available to you through normal administrative channels, you did not raise a concern about the conditions. Fudge shifted in his chair. The movement produced a small sound in the very quiet room. Dumbledore considered what he was going to say. He had considered it, of course, at length, in the weeks since the notification arrived. He knew what he was going to say and what he was not going to say, and the distance between those two things was the thing he had spent 40 years managing. The placement was necessary, he said. The conditions at 4 Privet Drive, Ive, were not adequate. I was aware, in a general sense, that they were not adequate, and I continued the placement nonetheless because the alternative was worse. More specifically, I continued the placement because to not continue it would have been to destroy the most fundamental magical protection available to Harry Potter, and the threats to his life are not historical. A silence. That is a large claim, Bones said, requiring a large explanation. Yes, Dumbledore said. You indicated in your letter that you would provide one. I did. Albus, Fudge said, from the end of the table, at a volume he had calibrated to sound like helpfulness. If there is some way to resolve this that doesn't require, if the full picture isn't something that needs to be in a formal file, Cornelius, Bones said, without turning her head, let him speak. Fudge sat back. The bowler hat moved. Dumbledore looked at Amelia Bones and made his calculation. The minimum. Not what she deserved to know, what was safe to disclose in this room with this file open and the investigation's wheels already turning. Harry Potter's mother died protecting him in the autumn of 1981, he said. The manner of that protection was not ordinary. A sacrifice made freely. A life given for the life of a specific person leaves a magical imprint. In this case, the imprint was so powerful that it transferred into Harry himself. The protection this created was, and is, anchored to one specific place by one specific mechanism, the blood of his mother's nearest living blood relative. Petunia Dursley is that relative. As long as Harry lives in that house and is able, genuinely, to call it home, the threat that killed his parents cannot touch him there. That threat is not destroyed. It is dormant. But it is not gone. Bones was watching him with the particular attention of someone who is building an exact structure out of what they're being given and noting where the gaps are. If Harry were permanently removed from that house, Dumbledore continued, under any arrangement that prevented him from returning to it and calling it home, fostering alternative guardianship, any new placement, immediately, irreversibly. He paused. I placed him with his aunt, because she is the only person in the world whose blood makes the enchantment possible. I have returned him there every year because the enchantment requires it. The conditions at that house were not what I would have chosen. They are what was available. Name the threat, Bones said, a small pause. The setting is not secured for that level of disclosure, Dumbledore said. I can provide it in a different context. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, you allowed a child to be confined with bars on his bedroom window because of a protective enchantment you told no one about. He knew better than to answer it as though it were. The enchantment, he said, is real. Its mechanism is verifiable. Its necessity is not, in my judgment, debatable. Your judgment, Bones said, was exercised without the knowledge or consent of the child, or of the child's other advocates, or of this department. She closed the file. The enchantment may be real. The necessity may be genuine. I am not in a position to evaluate either without the fuller account you've indicated you're prepared to give. In a secured context, she said that with a precision that meant, we will have that meeting, and you will not avoid it. Fudge leaned forward. The question of how much of this goes into the official record, whether this can remain a contained... The investigation is suspended, Bones said, turning to him, pending a fuller account from Professor Dumbledore, to be provided in the appropriate secure setting and the establishment of minimum welfare standards at the placement address. It is not closed. The file remains open. She looked at Dumbledore. Harry Potter will return to that house at the end of the school year. The conditions in which he returns will be agreed upon in writing. The department will conduct a follow-up inspection. That is what this looks like now. Fudge, who had wanted the investigation closed, sat back in his chair with the look of a man who has been given something he can technically work with, but is not happy about. Dumbledore held Bones's gaze. That is acceptable, he said. I didn't ask if it was acceptable, she said. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock on the 1st of September, and Harry was on it. He had a compartment with Ron and Ginny and 2 of Ron's dorm mates from last year, and the countryside slid past the window in long green panels as the train headed north. He had a pumpkin pasty he was eating slowly, because the eating of it was giving him something to do, and Ron was telling a story about Fred and George that Harry was following with approximately 30% of his attention. He knew Molly had written a letter. Ron had told him that. He knew the letter had gone to the ministry, and that there were people, ministry people, who had been to Privet Drive. He knew this from Ron, who had told him with the slightly sideways look of someone who knows they're delivering news of uncertain reception. He didn't know what had happened at the ministry after that. He didn't know what happened at the house. He didn't know what any of it meant for him, specifically, where he would go at the end of the school year, or what the summer after would look like, or whether the specific arrangement that had defined the first 12 years of his life was simply over now. The pumpkin pasty was very good. Honeydukes from the trolley. He ate it and looked out the window and thought about the inside of an office in London he had never been to, where people were, presumably deciding things, and tried to work out how he felt about that. He was not sure he had finished feeling it yet. He thought it might take a while. Outside, the last of the suburbs fell behind, and the land opened into the colors of early autumn, and the train carried him north. The sorting hat deliberated over Ginny for 4 seconds. Harry knew because he counted them, not because he was worried, exactly, but because he had been watching her face from the moment the first years filed into the great hall and Ginny's face was doing something complicated. She had spent the entire boat crossing from Hogsmeade Station with her jaw set in the particular way of a person who has a preference but refuses to admit it in case it doesn't come true. When she sat on the stool and Professor McGonagall placed the hat on her red hair, the jaw got tighter. 1 second, 2, 3, and then the hat opened its brim and called out, "Gryffindor," and Ginny Weasley flushed scarlet from her collar to her ears and walked to the Gryffindor table with the slightly unsteady relief of someone who has been holding their breath for slightly too long. She was worried, Ron said, watching her sit down at the far end of the table. She didn't look worried, Harry said. That's how she looks worried. Fred and George were already making enough noise to constitute a welcome, and Percy was demonstrating his prefect's badge to no one in particular by wearing it very visibly at the end of the table and pretending not to notice the first years looking at it. Ginny gave her brothers a wave that tried to be nonchalant and wasn't, and the feast appeared, and the great hall became the great hall in the way it always became itself when the term started. Noise and candlelight and the smell of roasting things, and Harry sat between Ron and Hermione and felt the particular quality of belonging to something he still didn't fully trust himself to believe in. He watched Dumbledore at the head table over the course of the feast, but he could read nothing in the headmaster's face. Dumbledore ate and spoke to Professor Sprout beside him, and once looked out over the hall with the expression Harry had come to understand meant he was thinking about something that had nothing to do with his dinner. Whatever had happened in London, and something had happened, Harry was certain of that from the shape of the summer's silences. It was not visible on that face. Dumbledore was very good at faces. Harry ate his lamb and decided he would not ask tonight. The second-year dormitory smelled of old stone and the cedar that came off the trunks, and it was exactly as Harry remembered it, which was one of the specific and uncomplicated pleasures of coming back. He sat on the edge of his bed and pulled off his shoes, while Neville unpacked, and Ron sprawled on his own bed in the way of someone who has been on a train since 11 that morning and considers horizontal a reasonable response. "She'll be fine," Ron said about Ginny, apparently still on the subject. "I know," Harry said. "She'll be brilliant, actually. She knows more spells than me, And she's only first year. Ron, what? I know she'll be fine. Harry put his shoes under the bed. You can stop reassuring both of us. Ron went quiet. Then, in the different tone of someone who has been waiting for a quieter moment, Mum wrote the letter in August. To the ministry about, the bars. You're the Dursleys. He said it carefully. She sent a formal complaint to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. There were people who went to Privet Drive to look at the house. He sat up slightly. I thought you should know all of it. Harry looked at the ceiling of the dormitory. The stone was very even up there, fitted together with the unhurried precision of something built to last centuries. I know she sent the letter, he said. You told me in August. I know. But I mean the investigators went to the house, and apparently Dumbledore was called in. Ron was watching him with the cautious attention of someone who thinks they are delivering good news and is not entirely certain. Mum was. She was right to do it, I think. She saw what you looked like. I know, Harry said. I think she was right. I know, Ron. Ron was quiet for a moment. You don't sound like you think it's good. Harry didn't say anything for long enough that Ron looked at the ceiling too, apparently deciding this was the correct thing to do. The problem, and Harry had spent the better part of 3 weeks trying to find the edges of it, on the Burrows orchard, and on the train and in the margins of the Great Hall feast, was that he couldn't find the right word for what he felt. Grateful was in there. He was grateful. Molly Weasley had looked at him standing in her garden at 4 a.m, and had asked a question, and had actually waited for the answer, and that mattered, in a way that was difficult to look at directly, because looking at it directly required acknowledging how rarely it had happened before. He was grateful. He was also frightened, and the frightened part was harder to explain, not of the Dursleys. Not, specifically, of what they would do when they found out. Though they would find out, and they would do something, and it would not be pleasant. But underneath that, beneath the ordinary fear of ordinary consequences, was a different thing entirely. The fear of what happened to him if there was nowhere to go back to. It was full of food and noise and people who wanted him in a way that still surprised him when he wasn't paying attention. But he had known it for a month, and the Weasleys were the Weasleys' family and not his. And the thing he couldn't explain to Ron was the feeling that had been following him since the summer. The feeling that someone had begun the process of taking away a door and had not yet told him what was on the other side of it. He had spent 11 years at Privet Drive, not wanting to be there. And now the bars were off, and the cat flap was documented, and people were going to offices and making decisions, and what he felt when he thought about never going back was not relief. It was something that felt, in the dark and honest part of it, like falling. He didn't say any of this. He looked at the stone ceiling which had been there for centuries and was not interested in his feelings about Surrey, and Ron eventually went back to unpacking, and by 10 o'clock they were both in bed in the dark, and the dormitory was quiet. Percy had the look, that September, just of someone performing a role with a thoroughness that had moved past competence into something else. He conducted his prefect rounds with precision. He answered questions from first years, as though the answers were in the relevant policy text, and he had read it that morning. He did not discuss the ministry complaint. When Fred mentioned it at breakfast once, and Fred had the instincts of someone who could identify a subject in about half a second, Percy moved the conversation to something else with a smooth institutional pivot that he had clearly been practicing. Harry saw it, over the weeks, in the way Percy moved through corridors, slightly straighter than his height required, badge always visible. He was 16 years old, and he had a ministry career in front of him, and a family that had formally antagonized the department he intended to work for, and he was managing this by being, in every observable way, perfectly correct, She found it on a late September evening, alone in the first-year dormitory, while the others were in the common room. Quote, X's as. She had been looking for her transfiguration notes, and instead found the small black book she didn't remember putting in, settled between her copy of magical drafts and potions and a pair of spare socks. It was slim and old, the cover worn smooth. She opened it. The pages were blank. She thought for a moment. Then she took out her quill and wrote carefully near the top of the first page. My name is Ginevra Weasley. The ink sat on the paper for a moment, then it sank into the page and disappeared as though the parchment had absorbed it. She stared at it. She waited. And then, slowly in a handwriting that was not hers, the notice from the Hogwarts Board of Governors arrived on Amelia Bones's desk on the 4th of October, which was a Monday and was already, in other respects, not an excellent morning. She read it once. The language was polished, which was to say it had been through several drafts, and the concern it expressed was thorough and entirely artificial. Lucius Malfoy, as governor of the board, was writing to express the board's profound concern at the recent revelations regarding the welfare of Harry James Potter, who occupied, the letter noted, a singular place in the hearts of the wizarding community. The governor felt that the board, as the body responsible for the oversight of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and specifically for the conduct of its headmaster, had both a right and a duty to open its own inquiry into the arrangements made by Albus Dumbledore for Harry Potter's domestic welfare. The governor was prepared to convene the board at the earliest possible date for this purpose, and looked forward to cooperating with the DMLE in its own parallel investigation. Bones set the letter down. She had been doing this long enough to recognize the specific architecture of the tactic, take someone else's investigation, frame your presence inside it as concerned oversight, and use the confusion about jurisdiction to produce delays leaks. And the general impression that everything is under review by everyone and therefore resolving at a pace that makes embarrassment manageable. It was a useful tactic in the right institutional environment. This was not the right institutional environment. She wrote her reply herself, as she had written the notification to Dumbledore herself, and for the same reason, she wanted the phrasing to be hers. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement's investigation into the welfare of Harry James Potter was a DMLE matter, conducted under its lawful authority to investigate potential endangerment of a minor wizard. The Hogwarts Board of Governors had no standing in welfare investigations conducted under DMLE jurisdiction. The board's oversight authority extended to the academic and administrative conduct of Hogwarts as an institution, not to child welfare law enforcement. If Governor Malfoy wished to make representations regarding the investigation, he was welcome to do so as a private individual through the proper channels, which were the same channels available to any member of the public with a concern to register. She sealed it and sent it back. Cornelius Fudge appeared in her office at 3:30. He had, she noticed, switched to a less vivid hat for the occasion, a deep burgundy, which was clearly intended to read as sober. He sat in the chair across from her desk with the expression of a man who had prepared several approaches and was selecting the first one. The Malfoy thing, he said, is resolved, she said. Yes, I saw your reply. He paused. It was. Very clear. Thank you. What I'm wondering, Fudge said, in the tone he used for things he had been wondering about for the last 6 hours and had been building up to saying, is whether there's a way to approach this that keeps the situation manageable. The board is one thing, but Lucius Malfoy is not someone who accepts a no-paragraph letter quietly, and given that he's already indicated a willingness to make noise, and given that the subject of the investigation is Harry Potter. The level of press attention, if this becomes complicated, Cornelius, Bones said. He stopped. The investigation is proceeding, she said. It has been suspended pending a further meeting with Dumbledore, which has been requested and will occur. The Board of Governors has no standing in it and will not be given any. If Lucius Malfoy goes to the press, he will be writing about a welfare investigation he has been explicitly and correctly told is not his concern, which will not reflect well on him. She looked at Fudge with the expression she used for people who needed something simple, stated plainly, "Is there another aspect of this you'd like to discuss?" Fudge, who had had 3 other aspects he'd like to discuss, sat back. "No," he said. "Thank you, Amelia." The fire in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts was lit despite the afternoon warmth, which meant Snape understood that Dumbledore had been sitting with something he found chilling. He arrived in the doorway without knocking and found the headmaster at his desk with his hands folded, looking at nothing in particular. "Lucius moved," Snape said. "I received a copy of his letter," Dumbledore said, "and the response." "Then you know the board motion failed." "Amelia Bones is difficult to maneuver," Dumbledore agreed. "This does not surprise me." Snape came further into the room. He had sources in the ministry he had never named to Dumbledore directly, and Dumbledore had never pressed him on them, which was one of the functional parts of their arrangement. "He'll try another angle," Snape said. The board was the obvious one. "He'll look for something less obvious. He usually does." Dumbledore looked at him. The portraits on the walls were being discreet. "You're pleased that Bones refused him?" Snape's expression did not change significantly. "I'm aware of what Lucius does with information he controls," he said. "An investigation he could influence is considerably more dangerous than an investigation he can't. Whatever Bones decides to do with it, she will at least decide it based on the evidence in her file." A pause. "I would prefer that." "I know," Dumbledore said. "And the reason you prefer it is not Harry's welfare." "The reason I prefer it," Snape said, with the even tone of a man who has decided how much of the truth he will give, "is that Lucius Malfoy controlling an investigation into Harry Potter's domestic situation produces outcomes I cannot model. I don't like outcomes I cannot model." Dumbledore said nothing. The fire crackled. Outside, the grounds were October-colored gold and brown, and the dark green of the firs, and Harry Potter was somewhere in the castle, in a class or a corridor, unaware that the walls of the situation around him were being tested from multiple sides, all of them claiming to act in his interests, each of them meaning something else entirely. The voice in the walls came on a Thursday, between herbology and charms. Harry stopped walking. It was cold, not a temperature, but a quality, in the sound itself, something that moved under the skin rather than through the air. It was coming from inside the stone, somewhere to his left, low and continuous, and not quite a sound he could describe, because it was in a register he couldn't place. And the words, if they were words, weren't words he could name either. "Harry," Ron said. Harry looked at the wall. "What is it?" Hermione said, from behind him. "Did you hear that?" Harry said. They both looked at him, then at the wall, then back at him with the expression of people who have heard nothing and cannot work out what the question is referring to.
"Hear what?"
Ron said. Harry stood there a moment longer, his hand not quite touching the stone. The sound was gone. The corridor was just a corridor. 2 students from Ravenclaw walking the other way. A draft from the staircase at the end, the distant sound of someone's shoes on the floor above. He walked on. He did not look back at the wall, because looking back at the wall would have required having something to say about it, and he didn't have anything to say about it, except that it had been cold, and it had been hissing, and he had been the only one who heard it. Those 3 facts were not a sentence he wanted to construct in front of Ron and Hermione yet. He filed it away. Ron raised the ginny thing at dinner, not loudly, in the way of someone who has been wanting to say something for a few days, and has been waiting for the right moment, and has decided that any moment is better than none. "She's not eating much," he said. "Have you noticed?" Harry looked down the table. Ginny was at the first-year cluster, sitting between 2 girls he didn't know the names of yet, and she was moving food around her plate with the distracted inattention of a person whose thoughts are somewhere else. "I've seen her look like that in the library," Hermione said, with the careful voice she used when she thought she might be about to worry about something. "Writing." "She's always writing," Ron said. "It's this little black book." "I've asked her about it twice, and she moves it before I can see it." He stabbed a potato. "She used to tell me things." Harry looked at Ginny at the other end of the table. She was still not eating. As he watched, she looked up, not at him, not at anything in particular, and then looked back down at her plate, and there was something in the quality of the look that made him think of the thing the hat had done at the sorting. That 4-second pause he'd counted, as though she were listening. He thought about saying something to Ron, and then didn't know what to say, and ate his dinner. October moved toward its end. Molly Weasley, in the Burrow kitchen, with Arthur on the 30th, received a brief letter from Percy confirming he had been assigned a new prefect duty involving the corridors on the 2nd floor. She wrote back that she was glad, and tucked the letter away and made tea, and did not mention to anyone the letter she was still waiting for from Amelia Bones about the Welfare Standards meeting. She would wait. Halloween tasted like food. Harry hadn't eaten. The 3 of them had gone to Nearly Headless Nick's Death Day party instead of the feast, a social obligation Harry hadn't known existed until 2 days before, delivered with the specific blend of hope and resignation that Nick used for most things involving the living. The party had been cold and dark, and had smelled strongly of rotting food left out for the benefit of ghosts, and now, making their way back through the corridors at the tail end of the evening, Harry was aware that the rest of the school had spent the last 3 hours in the Great Hall eating, and that he had spent 3 hours being politely dismal in a dungeon. He heard it through the wall. Brief this time, just a thread of it, cold and hissing, moving away from them at speed. He stopped walking. "What?" Ron said. "Didn't you—" "Hear what?" "Harry, we're going to miss the food." He let it go. He filed it next to the last time, in the growing uneasy folder in his chest, marked things he had no explanation for. They turned the corner into a corridor on the 2nd floor and stopped. The water was on the floor first, a thin, gleaming sheet of it, spreading from somewhere ahead. Then the torch bracket, and in the torch bracket, hanging rigid with its tail curled upward and its eyes wide and flat and wrong, Filch's cat. He knew her on sight. She was in every corridor, always watching, and the fact that she was now entirely motionless and hanging from a bracket like something placed rather than fallen was wrong in the way that things are wrong when the wrongness is obvious before you can name it. The message on the wall was written above her, in letters large enough to read from 20 feet. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the Here, beware." Harry heard the feast ending somewhere below. Heard the sound of students coming out of the Great Hall. He was looking at the wall when the first ones came around the corner, and by the time he thought to step back, the corridor was filling, and they were looking at him, and Draco Malfoy was at the front of the crowd with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment, specifically, "Enemies of the air, beware," Draco called out. "You'll be next, mudbloods." Hermione went very still beside Harry. Ron said something sharp and low under his breath. Then Filch arrived and looked at his cat, and his face did something that Harry had not expected to see on Filch's face, which was grief. It came and went in the same second, replaced by the thing Filch was more reliably. Thin and suspicious, and shaking slightly with the effort of managing what he felt by redirecting it. He pointed at Harry. "You," he said, "you did this." Dumbledore arrived with McGonagall and Snape and Lockhart in a cluster, and the corridor went quiet in the way that corridors went quiet when Dumbledore arrived. He looked at Mrs. Norris and then at the wall. His expression told Harry nothing. It had stopped telling Harry things. Dumbledore's expression. The cat was not dead, it turned out. She was petrified, which Dumbledore said quietly after a brief examination, and which was taken to the hospital wing. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were taken to Snape's office and asked at length how they came to be in that corridor at that time, and Harry explained Nick's party 3 separate times and had the impression he was believed by Dumbledore and McGonagall, and not believed by Snape. They were allowed back to Gryffindor at midnight, and the common room fell quiet when they walked in, and 2/3 of the faces Harry passed did the thing he was beginning to recognize, the quick, assessing glance that landed on him and then skipped away. Word reached the Ministry in pieces and not cleanly. The first piece arrived through Fudge's channels. Someone he knew on the school board, which meant it arrived with Lucius Malfoy's fingerprints, already on the framing before Fudge had read 3 sentences. Harry Potter had been found at the scene of a magical attack inside Hogwarts School. He was the only student present. The attack bore characteristics consistent with dark magic of a serious and intentional nature. The subject of a current Ministry welfare inquiry was now also, it appeared, the subject of a separate and very serious concern. Bones received her version through Dawlish, who had it from the DMLE's own liaison at Hogwarts, and she read it twice in the specific way she read things she intended to act on. She sent a reply to Dumbledore's office. She would be visiting Hogwarts at the earliest mutually convenient date for discussions that the current situation made urgent. The word convenient, she was aware, was doing no work in that sentence. Dumbledore was aware of this too. "She's coming in person," Fudge said when his secretary told him. "Yes, Minister," his secretary said. "Amelia Bones is coming to Hogwarts in person," Fudge said, which was him thinking aloud rather than informing anyone of anything new. There was, he was aware, a version of events in which this was very bad for him. The version in which Harry Potter was both the subject of a welfare complaint and the suspected agent of attacks on students, and Cornelius Fudge had been the person nominally overseeing both, was a version that the press could do a great deal with. He sent a note to Bones's office, asking to be kept informed. Bones's office sent back a confirmation that said, with perfect courtesy, nothing. The weeks after Halloween had a texture Harry had felt before. Not the specific texture, not the bars, not the cat flap, not the very specific quality of being hungry without any prospect of that changing soon. But the shape of it, the way a space could go different around you, the way people arranged themselves slightly differently when they were uncertain what you were. In the Dursleys' house, it had been everyone, and it had started when he was old enough to notice it, and hadn't stopped. At Hogwarts, it was more complicated. It was some people. It was the look in the corridor. It was the conversation that went quiet in a particular way when he sat down. He knew from the things Ron had told him that there was a file at the Ministry with his name on it. He knew a woman named Bones had been to Privet Drive, that investigators had photographed the marks on the window frame. He knew Molly had been waiting for something. He'd heard Arthur use the phrase welfare standards in a letter that had been read aloud by accident over breakfast. He didn't know what it meant for him. He knew better than to ask in a way that would produce an answer he couldn't control. The problem now was that the ministry file and the corridor whispers were about the same person, and he was that person. And the whispers had a word, air of Slytherin, that he couldn't explain away with the truth, because the truth about where he was on Halloween, and the air of Slytherin didn't generally go to Death Day parties by November. Ginny was sleepwalking. Ron found this out because he went to her dormitory after curfew to return a charms textbook she'd left in the common room and found her bed empty. He told Harry about it at breakfast the next morning, with the concentrated worry of someone who has decided that saying it quietly is the same as not panicking. Does she know where she was? No. He was eating his eggs without looking at them. She had mud on her robes when I got back. She was in bed, but there was mud on them. He went to Percy. Percy listened. He had the expression he'd been wearing since September, the one that communicated impeccable attention paired with a firm commitment to appropriate channels. He asked Ron how often this had happened. Ron said twice that he knew of. Percy said that first years were frequently unsettled in the early months. The transition was significant, the homesickness was common, disturbed sleep was documented as a natural response. He said he would keep an eye on it. He did not take it to Dumbledore. He filed it in the category of things being handled, which meant it was in a category but not on a desk. And the difference between those two things was not visible from where Percy stood, and would not be visible for some weeks. Harry went to Hagrid's hut on a cold Saturday in mid-November with Ron and Hermione. Partly for pumpkin cake, and partly because there were corridors at Hogwarts that felt, lately, like being watched from both directions, and Hagrid's hut was outside them. Hagrid was glad to see them, in the distracted way of someone who is glad to see people but is thinking about something else. He made tea in the enormous kettle, and produced the pumpkin cake, and asked how classes were going with the specific casualness of a person who wants to talk about something ordinary. Harry noticed the roosters. There was a new pen of them against the side of the pumpkin patch. 6, 7 birds settled into the mud in the grey November afternoon. He pointed at them and asked what they were for, and Hagrid said something short and evasive that wasn't an explanation, and Harry noticed that Hagrid was not quite looking at him when he said it. "You all right?" Harry said. "Fine," Hagrid said. "Course." "Eat your cake." He ate his cake. Hagrid drank his tea and looked at the grounds through the small window and said nothing about the roosters, and the conversation moved to other things. A visiting owl Hermione had received, Ron's description of a charms essay that had gone badly. Hagrid laughed at the right places, but he kept looking at the grounds. Harry remembered the roosters on the walk back up to the castle, and thought about the hissing in the walls, and thought about Mrs. Norris in the torch bracket, and thought about the space between all three things which he did not yet know how to fill. The castle lights were coming on in the early dark. He went back inside. The dueling club met for the first and only time on the 17th of December in the great hall with the tables pushed back and a stage erected at one end, and it lasted, as a pedagogical exercise, approximately 9 minutes before it became something else. Lockhart had organized it. This was apparent from the purple banner and the cheerful program of events, which began with a demonstration duel between himself and Professor Snape. The demonstration lasted about 2 seconds. Snape disarmed Lockhart with the efficient precision of a man who has been waiting for permission to do this for some time, and Lockhart slid off the far end of the stage and collected himself with the dazed brightness of someone determining how much of this to incorporate into the lesson plan. Snape, in his black robes, turned to address the students, with an expression that Harry had learned to read as the outer surface of something more complicated. They paired off. Harry was put with Draco, which was not an accident. He knew it wasn't an accident the moment Snape said it, from the way Draco's mouth moved in the particular almost smile that meant he had been told to expect this. They faced each other on the stage. Harry had his wand out and was thinking about the disarming charm, the reasonable thing, the expected thing, when Draco said, "Serpensortia," with a flick of his wrist, and a thick black snake erupted from his wand and landed on the stage between them. The crowd made the sound that crowds made when a snake appeared, a collective intake that was half alarm and half theatre. Harry looked at the snake. The snake raised its head and oriented toward the students at the edge of the stage, toward a second-year Hufflepuff, who had taken a step back and gone very pale. Harry said something. He was aware, very specifically, of what it felt like from the inside. Perfectly clear, perfectly logical, perfectly directed at the snake. The snake stilled. Harry said something else. The Hufflepuff made a sound and backed away. Someone screamed. Ron shouted Harry's name from somewhere in the crowd, and Snape stepped in and vanished the snake with a finite incantatum. And Harry was still looking at where the snake had been when Hermione took hold of his arm and said quietly, "Walk." And he walked. "What did you do?" Ron said when they were in the corridor. He was looking at Harry with a very specific expression, the same expression he'd worn in the car coming back from Privet Drive when Harry had said a while and couldn't finish the sentence. The expression of someone frightened by something real. "I told it to stop," Harry said. "You weren't speaking English," Ron said. Harry looked at him. "You were speaking Parseltongue," Hermione said carefully, "to the snake. Everyone heard it. It sounded like hissing." The Hufflepuff had thought Harry was sicking it on him. Harry understood that in the few seconds of very quiet that followed, standing in a stone corridor 2 weeks before Christmas, and the understanding settled over the 2 investigations, with the particular weight of something that completed a picture no one had been trying to draw. The heir of Slytherin spoke to snakes. The joint session at the Ministry was held the following week in the same Level 2 meeting room where Dumbledore had met Bones in September. It was larger now. A 3rd chair had been added at the end of the table, and in it sat Lucius Malfoy, in robes that had been selected for the specific gravity of the occasion. Bones had allowed him 1 seat at her table. She had not allowed him a copy of the file. Dumbledore came without an advocate. He sat across from Bones with his hands folded and his half-moon spectacles in place, and told Snape to wait in the corridor, and Snape did not argue about it. The evidence Bones laid out was the same as September: the photographs, the cupboard letters, and the additional material, the Ministry's growing record of the chamber attacks, the petrification of students, the accusations directed at Harry Potter by his fellow students, the Parseltongue incident from the evening before. She did not present these as connected to the welfare matter directly. She presented them as the context in which the welfare matter was now being considered, and the context in which Dumbledore's selective disclosure in September was no longer adequate. "In September," she said, "you told me the protective enchantment existed and that it required the placement. You declined to name the specific threat. I accepted that, conditionally pending a fuller account. The fuller account has not arrived. Meanwhile, the student who is the subject of your protection arrangement is now also the primary suspect in a series of attacks that have petrified 3 students, is publicly known to be a Parselmouth, and is sitting at Hogwarts over the Christmas holidays unable to explain himself." She looked at him. "Provide the fuller account." Dumbledore provided it. He had thought, before this moment, about what it would feel like to say it plainly, to say it without the careful, non-revealing language he had used for 12 years, without the selective framing and the strategic omissions. He had thought it would feel like losing something. It felt instead like setting something down that had been heavier than he had acknowledged. "The enchantment is called the Bond of Blood," he said. "It was created in 1981 by the death of Harry's mother, Lily Potter, who died to protect him. The protection is anchored in the blood of her nearest living relative, Petunia Dursley. As long as Harry can call that house home, genuinely in the sense the charm recognizes, and as long as he returns there, the specific entity responsible for the deaths of his parents cannot harm him at that address. The entity is not destroyed. It exists. It has resources and adherents. Harry's survival 11 years ago made him its primary concern." He paused. "To permanently remove Harry from the Dursley house before his 17th birthday, under any arrangement that prevents him from returning and calling it home, would break the bond of blood immediately, irreversibly. He would have no magical protection against the thing that has already killed his parents and has never stopped intending to kill him. The room was very quiet. The conditions at 4 Privet Drive, Dumbledore continued, were inadequate. They should not have been what they were. I knew the letters were addressed to a cupboard, and I chose the bond of blood over the cupboard. I knew, in general terms, that the arrangement was not comfortable. Every summer, I returned him to a home where he was not wanted in conditions that were wrong because the protection required it and because I judged the risk of his death to be worse than the cost of his discomfort. I do not ask you to agree that this was the right calculation. I ask you to understand that it was the only one I had available." He did not ask for absolution. He had enough self-knowledge left to understand he didn't deserve it. Snape sat on a wooden bench in the corridor outside and waited. He had been waiting for 40 minutes. He was aware through the closed door that Dumbledore was speaking at length, and he could construct the outline of what was being said from the architecture of the preparation, the things Dumbledore had said to him in the last week. The specific expression on his face when he drafted the final version of what he planned to disclose. The bond of blood, its cost 11 summers. He wanted Dumbledore to succeed. He wanted the investigation paused, and the bond preserved, and Harry Potter alive and safe, and returned to Privet Drive under improved conditions at the end of the school year. Because Harry Potter alive was the thing that mattered, and the thing that mattered. He also found, sitting on the wooden bench in the corridor with his hands on his knees, that he wanted something else, something he would not have named to Dumbledore or McGonagall or anyone who might have been able to use the information. He wanted someone to have said it 11 years ago, that this is not acceptable, that a child cannot live in a cupboard, that the bond of blood is a necessity and the cupboard is a choice, and those are not the same thing. No one had said it. He had not said it. He had known about the cupboard because the addressing charm had been a topic of administrative discussion in 1991, and he had drawn his own conclusions, and he had said nothing because he had looked at the thing, and then he had looked away. He sat with that for a while. Bones's verdict was given in writing. The welfare investigation was formally paused, not closed. The placement at 4 Privet Drive, I would not be permanently terminated in view of the security rationale provided. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement would receive a formal undertaking from Dumbledore regarding minimum welfare standards at the placement, and a follow-up inspection would be conducted prior to Harry's return at the end of the current school year. The investigation remained open pending compliance. Lucius Malfoy withdrew the Board of Governors' motion the following day. A welfare investigation formally paused, no longer escalating, no longer in the active phase where political pressure might reframe it, provided nothing he could attach a hearing to. He was not done, but he had lost this particular set of moves, and he understood the board well enough to know that returning too quickly looked like desperation. Arthur told Molly in the kitchen. He had the look he wore when he'd been carrying something for a while, and she had learned in 20 years of marriage to let him get to it at his own pace. And she made tea and sat across from him and waited. He told her about the bond of blood, about what it was, what it required, and specifically, carefully, what the bars on the window and the cat flap and the cupboard had existed alongside. The thing she had sent the letter to stop, he said, and then the thing the letter might have stopped if it had succeeded. Molly sat very still. She had known, since the morning she sealed the envelope, that she was doing the right thing. She had sent it the way she did most things she believed in, completely, without hedging, because a half measure in a thing that matters is worse than no measure at all. She had been right to send it. She was still certain of that, in the part of herself, that was her mother's daughter and had lost brothers in a war, and understood, on a cellular level, what it meant to leave a child in a dangerous place. But she had sent it without knowing what she was reaching into, and she sat at her own kitchen table in December and understood for the first time the weight of not knowing. The bars, she said, were wrong, Arthur said. That's not changed. But if I had, you didn't know, he said. No one told you. She was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock tracked the hands of her family, as it always did, and Harry's was one of them, even though it wasn't and had been since August. Harry spent Christmas at Hogwarts with Ron and a handful of others, and the half-empty castle had a quality of breathing that it didn't have when it was full. Ginny had gone home for the holidays, and her trunk had gone with her, and without knowing it, Harry noticed the absence of something he couldn't name, some low-level tension in the Gryffindor common room that had become background noise and was now gone. He slept. He ate the Christmas feast with Ron and the Weasley twins who had stayed, and he pulled crackers and wore a paper crown, and for a few days the specific pressure of the autumn lifted enough that he could feel the shape of the air without it. He did not know about the joint session. He did not know about the bond of blood or the formal undertaking or Bones's paused, not closed verdict. He knew Molly had sent a letter. He knew something was happening. He knew he would have to go back to Privet Drive at the end of the year. And for the first time he wasn't sure whether that felt like the usual thing or like something that had changed. The message appeared on the 1st of June, and the school had been waiting for it for 8 months without knowing that was what it was doing. The attacks had continued through the spring, a Gryffindor second year, then a Hufflepuff, then Hermione, who had been found petrified beside a corridor mirror she had apparently been carrying for reasons no one could yet explain. The accusations against Harry had escalated and then plateaued into a background condition of the school year, the kind of thing that was always present and stopped being news. Ginny had got thinner and quieter. Ron had told Percy again in March, and Percy had said he would speak to her, head of house, and then his badge had caught the light and he had straightened up slightly, and Harry had understood that the badge was doing a lot of load-bearing work for Percy's sense of being in control of the situation. The message was written on the wall outside the library, in the same style as the first one, large, deliberate letters, written in something that looked very like red paint and was not. Her skeleton will lie in the chamber forever. McGonagall read it in the morning and went grey around the edges of her face, By 10 o'clock, she was telling the teachers that the school would send the students home. By 11, Harry and Ron knew, from listening at the wrong door at the right moment, that Ginny was the her in the sentence. Lockhart had claimed, at various points throughout the year, that he knew exactly where the chamber was and had every intention of dealing with it personally. And so, Harry and Ron went to his office, prepared for an ally, and found him packing. The conversation that followed was short and produced more useful information than Lockhart had intended, which was roughly how all conversations with Lockhart had gone since September. He was escorted to the second floor with a wand at his back. He attempted, in the bathroom, to turn his memory charm on Harry and Ron. The charm rebounded off Ron's damaged wand and caught him instead, and Lockhart stood in the bathroom with a beatific and entirely empty expression and said he wasn't entirely sure who he was. Harry opened the sink. The parcel tongue came the same way it always did, perfectly clear from the inside, and the entrance opened and they went down. The chamber was cold and vast and smelled like standing water and old stone and something under both of those things, something Harry's body. He walked through the dark with the beam of his wand ahead of him, and Lockhart drifting vaguely behind, and Ron somewhere in the rock fall that had separated them. And he came through the last set of stone serpents into the chamber itself. He ran to her. She was cold. Her wand was on the ground near her hand, and she wasn't moving. "She won't wake," said a voice behind him. He turned. The boy was standing at the far end of the chamber, with Harry's wand in his hand, and he was 16 years old and tall and black-haired, and had the particular quality of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and was enjoying it. Tom Riddle's memory looked entirely solid, entirely present, entirely himself, and that was the thing that was wrong, Harry understood, because the diary was on the floor beside Ginny, and the memory had been drawing from her to become this. Riddle explained it with the patience of someone who has no reason to hurry. He threw Harry's wand aside when he was done explaining. He set the basilisk on him. Harry shut his eyes. He remembered this specifically, to shut his eyes because the basilisk's gaze killed and a reflection petrified, and he had no intention of either. He heard it in the pipes first, the vast cold movement of something enormous, and then the chamber filled with the sound of scales on stone, and he could feel the air move as it passed, and he kept his eyes shut, and thought with a clarity he hadn't expected that he was 12 years old, and he was going to die in a cave under a school, and no one was going to know how to explain it. Something landed beside him with a sound like wind. He opened his eyes. Fawkes the Phoenix stood on the chamber floor with a battered sorting hat in his talons. He looked at Harry with the bright, calm intelligence of a creature that has not been surprised in several 100 years. Harry picked up the hat. He put his hand inside it. He pulled out a sword. The hilt was silver. The rubies along the blade caught the torchlight. It was heavier than he expected, and he held it with both hands, and didn't think about anything except the basilisk, whose eyes Fawkes had already gone for, 2 swift, precise strikes, and which was now swinging its enormous head in a wide arc through the chamber, blind and enormously fast, and oriented to sound. Harry ran toward it. He climbed the basilisk's body because there was nothing else available. He drove the sword into the roof of its mouth. The basilisk convulsed under him, and he held on and drove it deeper, and the thing fell and was still, and Harry was still on it, and then he was off it, and then he was sitting on the chamber floor with the basilisk fang in his arm, and the sword on the stones beside him, and the room was very quiet. The fang. He looked at it. The basilisk's venom was already doing what it did. He could feel his arm going wrong, going dark up toward his shoulder. Riddle's memory was watching him die with an expression of studied appreciation. Harry looked at the diary. He reached for the nearest broken fang on the chamber floor and stabbed the diary. Ink poured out of it like blood. Harry stabbed it again and again, until the pages were wet and black, and the screaming, not a sound exactly, more a quality of the air, stopped, and Riddle's memory dissolved from the feet up with an expression of total disbelief that Harry had just enough consciousness left to find satisfying. Ginny woke up gasping on the chamber floor. The Phoenix cried on Harry's arm. The wound didn't close all at once. It was a slow pulling together, a warmth that moved up from the wound against the direction the venom had been moving, and he sat on the chamber floor in the dark and breathed, and the basilisk was very dead beside him, and the diary was in pieces. And Ginny was alive. There were ministry investigators at Hogwarts when they came back up. This was, Harry would later understand, because there had been ministry investigators at Hogwarts intermittently since September, because Amelia Bones did not close investigations she had formally opened, and the welfare inquiry had kept official eyes on the school in a way that the chamber attacks had now intersected with. When the crisis resolved, when Harry and Ron and Ginny and the amnesiac Lockhart came back up through the sink in the second-floor bathroom, there were people with official credentials in the building within the hour. The diary was recovered from the chamber. The investigators who handled it were careful about it in the way of people who could feel that something was wrong with an object before they could name what. Their report, delivered to Amelia Bones the following afternoon, noted that the artifact appeared to contain or have contained a fragment of powerful and deliberate dark magic well in excess of what any standard dark artifact would produce, and that it had demonstrably possessed and influenced an 11-year-old girl over a period of several months, and that it had been placed in her possession by a deliberate act. The report did not identify the object as a Horcrux, because that knowledge was not available to them. It identified it as something that warranted the most serious classification available and the full attention of the department. Bones read the report and sent it to Fudge with one sentence of covering note, the question of how this object came to be in Ginevra Weasley's school. Supplies requires an immediate answer. Lucius Malfoy arrived at Dumbledore's office the afternoon after the chamber was cleared, because he had heard, through the channels he always heard things through, that something had happened involving Harry Potter, and he intended to be in the room before the framing of it solidified. He came with Dobby, who stood behind him and to the left, and looked at Harry with enormous eyes that were doing something Harry couldn't read. "I understand there's been a development," Lucius said pleasantly. "There has," Dumbledore said. He picked up the destroyed diary from his desk. It was punctured in 4 places by Basilisk Fang and stained with something that had been its ink. He held it out toward Lucius. "Perhaps you recognize it. I've never seen it." "Harry," Dumbledore said. Harry looked at Lucius Malfoy, who had reached into Ginny's cauldron in a bookshop in August, and whose hand had come back empty. He had not understood at the time what had gone into the cauldron. He understood it now. "He put it in her school things," Harry said, "at Flourish and Blots. He reached into her cauldron, and I saw him put his hand in twice. Lucius's face did not move. Dobby made a small involuntary sound. Dumbledore turned the destroyed diary in his hands. "I will be providing this to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement," he said, in the voice of a man with no reason to hurry, "along with Harry's account and the investigators' preliminary findings, and the department will conduct its own inquiry into how it came to be in Ginevra Weasley's possession. I expect that inquiry will proceed to wherever the evidence leads." Lucius turned to go. He swept toward the door with the absolute composure of a man who has decided that he has nothing more to say in this room. And it would have worked if Harry had not called after him Dobby, and if Dobby had not looked up at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for 11 years for someone to notice he was there. Harry pulled off his shoe. He pulled off his sock. He stuffed the sock inside the destroyed diary, now wrapped around itself, and lobbed it down the stairs toward where Lucius was. Lucius caught it. He looked at the sock in his hand. He looked up at Harry with an expression that could have heated the whole floor. Then, with the contemptuous precision of a man who refuses to be associated with something, he flung it aside. Dobby caught it before it touched the ground. The look on Dobby's face was something Harry had no words for. Lucius stood on the stair below and understood what he had done, and the understanding moved through his face like weather, and then his face went still, and he walked away, and the sound of his footsteps on the stone was very precise and diminishing, and then it was gone. "I did," Dumbledore said. "You also placed him in a position in which a 12-year-old boy required a phoenix and a legendary sword to survive." She was not unkind when she said it. She was exact. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The investigation's findings will reflect both. Dumbledore looked at the window of his office, where Fawkes was preening on his perch, with the serene self-assurance of a creature whose crying had done what it was supposed to do. "I know," he said. "Good," said Amelia Bones. "Then we understand each other. The Hogwarts Board of Governors met on the 10th of June and expelled Lucius Malfoy in 11 minutes. The meeting, Arthur told Molly afterward, had apparently been brief, not because the board was efficient, but because there was nothing to discuss. The man had placed a dark artifact of confirmed and significant power into the school supplies of an 11-year-old girl. The artifact had then influenced that girl for 9 months, directed her to open a chamber in the school's foundations, and come within a very small margin of killing her. The board's inquiry into Albus Dumbledore's welfare arrangements, which Lucius Malfoy had convened in October with the expressed concern of a man of the community who could not sit on his hands, had been brought by a man who was at that moment concealing his role in placing a weapon in a child's schoolbooks. The board voted on this in one round, without significant deliberation, and the result was 10-1. The one dissenting vote was not Lucius Malfoy, who was no longer in the room. Amelia Bones sent the formal close of the welfare investigation on the 15th of June, addressed to Dumbledore, and copied to the Weasley family as the original complainants. The finding was, as she had told Dumbledore it would be fair to both sides, without softening either. The conditions at 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey, had been inadequate and had constituted mistreatment of a minor wizard over an extended period. That finding stood. The placement at that address would not be permanently terminated, given the verified security rationale provided by the headmaster of Hogwarts. The department accepted that the bond of blood was a genuine and active protective mechanism and that its requirements were not negotiable. However, Albus Dumbledore had provided formal undertakings to the Ministry of Magic, lodged in the department's records, committing to the following: that Harry Potter would receive adequate food and a proper bedroom for the duration of his annual summer residence at the Dursley address, that he would be permitted to correspond freely with his friends and guardians by owl post, that he would not be confined to his room or otherwise physically restricted in that house. The investigation was formally closed. The file remained in the department's records. Molly read it twice at the kitchen table, while Arthur watched her face. When she set it down, she looked out the window at the garden, which was producing something interesting in the east bed that she would need to deal with. And she said, "She got it right." "She did." Arthur said both things, Molly said. Yes, Arthur received his formal reprimand from the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office on the 16th of June. It was a moderate reprimand, with no recommendation for demotion or further action, which was, the ministry's way of acknowledging that it did not currently wish to be in the business of pursuing the man whose wife's formal complaint had led, through a chain of events that the official record would never quite connect, but that everyone in the relevant offices understood, to the exposure of Lucius Malfoy's diary scheme. The reprimand was placed in Arthur's personnel file. His supervisor, who had conducted the original interview in Office 4B in August, sent it to him with a covering note that said, in its entirety, "Please ensure this does not happen again," and then went to lunch. Arthur told Molly about the reprimand at dinner. She said she was sorry. He said there was nothing to be sorry about. They both knew the car had been worth it. Harry sat in the chair across from Dumbledore's desk and looked at the silver instruments on the shelves and tried to find the right beginning for the question. He had been trying to find it since August, since the morning in the Burrows garden, when Molly had asked how long, and he hadn't been able to answer. He had tried in the dormitory with Ron, and he hadn't found it there either. He had carried it through Halloween and December and the dueling club and 6 months of being the suspected heir of Slytherin, and he had taken it into the chamber with him, and it had been there when Fawkes cried on his arm, and the wound closed, and the basilisk was dead. "Why the Dursleys?" he said. It wasn't quite the right shape, but it was a start. Dumbledore looked at him over his half-moon spectacles, and Harry looked back with the expression of someone who has 12 years of practice at being patient about things he cannot change. He had a scar from a basilisk fang that Madame Pomfrey had dressed that morning. He had killed a 1,000-year-old snake with a sword. "Your mother's sacrifice," Dumbledore said, "created something very old and very powerful. When Lily chose to die for you, chose in the specific magical sense that means she was given the chance to flee and did not take it. She put something into you, into your skin and your blood, a protection that can extend to where you live, or as long as you live there, but only while the anchor holds." "The anchor is Petunia," Harry said. A pause. I know what I was told when Bones was here," Harry said. "I know Petunia's blood is why the house works. I know something is out there that wants to kill me and can't while I'm there." He paused. "What I don't know is why the cupboard." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Outside, Fawkes shifted on his perch and made a low sound and was still. "The cupboard," Dumbledore said, "is the part that was my failure. The bond of blood required that you return to that house. It required that you be able to call it home, in the sense that the magic recognizes, genuine, not performed. I was concerned that any pressure I brought to bear on the arrangement would affect your relationship with your aunt and uncle in ways that made that harder. I told myself the conditions were an inconvenience and the protection was a lifeline, and that the calculation was obvious." He stopped. "I did not look very closely at the conditions. I knew about the cupboard, and I chose not to intervene. And that was a choice, and it had a cost, and the cost was yours. The room was very quiet." "I know," Dumbledore said, "that I'm asking you to hold two things simultaneously, that your mother's sacrifice is the reason you are alive, and that the arrangement built on that sacrifice was wrong, in ways I allowed to continue. I am not asking you to forgive me for the second in light of the first. I am telling you that they are both true, and that you are entitled to whatever you decide to do with the truth of them." Harry looked at the silver instruments on their shelves. He thought about the bars on the window that were no longer there. He thought about the bracket marks that were still in the wood. "I don't know what to do with it," he said. "You don't have to know yet," Dumbledore said. "Molly was making something with lemons when Harry arrived at the Burrow in the last week of June. He could smell it from the garden gate." The twins were doing something inadvisable with a garden gnome in the east bed, and Ron came to the door before Harry knocked, which meant he'd been watching from the window, and Harry didn't say anything about it. He ate 3 things before Molly brought out whatever the lemon thing was, and then he ate that too, and she sat across from him while he did with the expression she wore when she was building up to something. "Did you know," she asked, "that your mother had done something that was still working, still keeping you alive?" Harry thought about it. He thought about the way the story had come to him in pieces, from Ron, from Dumbledore, from Bones's formal document that Arthur had read aloud, from the chamber and what had happened in it with the sword and the fang and Fawkes. "I knew about the sacrifice," he said. "Everyone knows about the sacrifice. I didn't know it was still running, that it was still costing something." He looked at the tabletop. "I didn't know it was in the house." Molly looked at him for a moment. Then she put her hand over his. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that was more than that, more than the specific weight of her hand on his, the kitchen warm around them, the lemons doing what lemons did in the air of a house that was full. He didn't pull away. Harry arrived at 4 Privet Drive Ive on the 20th of July. Vernon Dursley opened the front door and said nothing. Not nothing in the way of someone who had been told to be quiet. Nothing in the way of someone who had made a calculation, and the calculation was silence. He was mid to late, middle-aged and large, and had the aspect of a man who understood, for the first time, that the letter he received from the ministry had the weight of a thing that was going to be checked. Harry went upstairs. The bedroom was the second on the right. The window was open. There were no marks on the sill where the bars had been removed. Dumbledore had sent someone to repair the frame, and the wood was smooth. Harry ran his thumb along it anyway. The door had no cat flap. He looked at the space in the lower panel where it had been, which was also repaired and smooth, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and felt the weight of the room. Hedwig's cage was on the desk. The door of the cage was open. The padlock was nowhere he could see. He looked for it for a moment out of habit, and then stopped looking, because there was no padlock, and the absence of it was the kind of thing he was going to have to get used to, which was a sentence he hadn't expected to be in his situation. He put his trunk down. He sat on the bed. Hedwig landed on his shoulder from the windowsill with the proprietary confidence she had always had about shoulders, and he sat there in the second bedroom in the last week of July, with the window open to the summer evening, which smelled like cut grass and the Dursleys' neighbour's car. He would be here for 3 weeks. Then the Burrow. Then Hogwarts. September 1st, his 3rd year. Whatever that would bring, he had made it through the second one. He had done it with Ron and Hermione and the Weasleys, and a sword that had appeared when he needed it, and a phoenix that had cried on his arm. And somewhere in London a woman named Amelia Bones had written down in official ministry language that the conditions had been inadequate. He thought about his mother, about the thing she had left him, about the way it lived in his skin and in the walls of this house, that he had spent 11 years wanting to leave and 3 weeks in August wanting to return to, and the strange, crooked way those 2 things sat next to each other. He didn't know yet what to do with it. He thought maybe you didn't have to know, not at 12. Maybe it was enough to be sitting here with Hedwig on his shoulder and the window open and no bars between him and the summer evening. The bars were gone. It was enough.